Okay, welcome everyone to another Integration Quest study group. Our focus today is on a question that keeps circulating around and around is like, what is going on with the MuleSoft licensing? I know last year we were helping someone on their account with a MuleSoft license and we're like, okay, so how many vCores do you have? And they were like, we have X amount of flows and X amount of, and we're like, what? What do you mean? What is that? So we had no idea. I didn't. So to dispel a lot of this confusion, we call upon the experts, and James Parks is our expert today on this. And so, James, thank you so much for joining us for this. He's going to be giving us a breakdown on cores versus flows and messaging and how this all plays out. So I know many of you reached out to me and said that you would not be able to make it to this event, so it is being recorded. So we will post that right after that. So a few housekeeping things real quick is the code of conduct. And I just have to laugh when I read this because it is so important in that occasionally we have some attendees who slightly misbehave in this room, and hasn't been happening lately, thankfully. All has been good in that realm. But the rule of thumb is if your mom and dad would have told you not to do it, then just don't do it. Okay, there you go. Now, to introduce our guests, I'd like to introduce James Parks, who's a dear friend of mine as well as an associate as instructors. It was funny, James, if you remember when as we were going through the journey, I think I taught James and James taught me. Now James and I are tag teaming on other things. It's just been so much fun, as we have been walking on this journey. So I am so proud to introduce to you James Parks. Yes, he was a MuleSoft instructor. He has now moved over into sales, and his title is a cloud account executive. So James, without further ado, I would love to go ahead and let me stop sharing. So if you have things to share also, I'm going to stop my share here and pass it to you now. So welcome, James. Glad to have you here with us.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Diane. Just before I share my slides again, thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Diane and team, for inviting me. Super excited to be chatting with you about this. As Diane said, I've been a part of the MuleSoft community for 3-4 years now. Started off as an instructor for over 2 years, and now I'm really an automation specialist. So I cover the broader MuleSoft portfolio and really the pre-sales engagements, answering a bunch of the technical questions that come up. So super excited to be chatting with you all today. I will have some slides. Feel free to make this as interactive as possible. I am working off of one screen today because I just recently moved. So if questions come up in the chat, then would you feel free to call those out to me?
Absolutely. Got you on that.
Thank you. Awesome. So let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see that slide deck okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Oops. So a lot of people ask, first and foremost, when this new pricing and packaging discussion comes up, why is it that we introduced it, and what are the benefits that customers get? So first and foremost, the reason is because historically MuleSoft, to be totally honest, was looked at as an enterprise grade solution. So for smaller companies, they frequently discounted it. So that lower entry point was one big challenge that we designed this pricing and packaging to help overcome. Another was scalable. So with the vCore model, if you wanted to deploy a single new application, you'd have to buy an entire vCore, even if you wanted to deploy that with a 0.1 vCore instance. So that meant that you had to basically bite off larger projects in order for it to be cost feasible for you to go through and just get that additional one project that you were originally thinking about. We also have been expanding what actually falls under the MuleSoft umbrella. And so because we've been expanding what falls under the MuleSoft umbrella, we really wanted the pricing and packaging to be future-proof, to account for what happens if we add a new tool, a new feature, functionality. How would that fit into the pricing and packaging? We don't want people to have to constantly relearn something new. So those are the really three main buckets. To be totally honest, What I want to do is I want to go through and explore the concepts that underpin the new pricing and packaging model, but wanted to really give that brief overview for the why. Okay. So as Diane called out, that main change that occurred with the new pricing and packaging model was the transition from your cores, your vCores, to what's called flows and messages. So cores and vCores are really the concept of if you're deploying to Cloud Hub, because Cloud Hub is hosted on AWS EC2 instances, it's how many virtual cores on those AWS EC2 instances are allocated to your applications. And then if you're familiar with that older pricing and packaging model, you would have to actually go through and account for increasing the allotment of vCores in order to handle higher data throughputs if your application had peak periods, say around Thanksgiving. The change has been more to these flows and messages, which is really the flows are around the number of applications that you're deploying roughly. We'll talk more in a little bit about how the flows are actually measured. In fact, we're going to go one level deeper and then 2 levels deeper. Messages are just corresponding to how many triggering events for your application you have. And then data throughput, the reason why it's a different color here is because it's actually one that very, very small fraction of our customers are actually even need to consider, but that's actually the size of your payloads that are being transferred through your application. So when we think about data throughput, that could be if you're transferring a 100 gigabyte file, that will be 100 gigabytes towards your data throughput. So just keep that in mind. So I do want to dive deeper. And again, we're going to go 1 level deeper and then 2 levels deeper, where I actually have a couple of slides that explain these with a couple of graphics. But at a high level, your flows are the flows that are being built out inside of your MuleSoft application. So if I have an HTTP listener and then a bunch of steps after that HTTP listener, there could be a choice router, a scatter gather, etc. Doesn't matter what's happening on that tail end, but that HTTP listener triggering my application would correspond to one flow. Now, if I have a one listener with a get method listening to a resource path called test, and another that's a post method on test, and I have those 2 separate listeners, those would be your 2 separate flows. So roughly, you can think about flows as being the number of triggers inside of your application. So if I have an application that has 3 different triggers, 3 different HTTP listeners, then that would be 3 flows. There's one nuance to this that we'll get to a little bit later, but for the vast majority of cases, that is a correct overview.
Is the nuance the API kit router?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay, I'll wait. I'm holding back.
Yeah, I have a slide specifically with that API kit router on there.
Okay, good.
And part of the reason why is otherwise the API kit router is an exception to this, because otherwise you could use the API kit router to basically get an infinite number of flows by using the API kit router as a single listener that then divvies it up to a bunch of other flows on the back end. So that's kind of the reasoning behind that, but we can dive deeper into that when we get there. I will call out subflows don't count towards your flow allotment because they don't have triggers, for instance. Or private flows don't count towards your flow allotment because they also don't have listeners. So it is those flows with your listeners, with the one exception of the API kit router that we're going to talk about later on, that will count towards your total flow allotment. And again, your messages are the number of triggering events for your application. So if you receive 10 HTTP requests to an HTTP listener, that'd be 10 messages. And then your data throughput is the actual size, the number of bytes for the payloads that are going through your application. So again, I want to take a step back and ask a question about why, though. Why is it that we have this new pricing and packaging when the vCore model was around for so long? And it all goes back to, first off, conceptually, this is how people think about their integrations. Conceptually, companies don't look at their tech stack and say, I need to integrate Salesforce and NetSuite. I think about that in terms of 10 vCores. Granted, that would be an absurdly large number for a Salesforce to NetSuite integration, but you don't think about it in terms of that the vCores where your applications are going to connect to. You think about it in terms of what you need flowing between Salesforce and NetSuite. So if you want to count information flowing, maybe you have a listener listening to Salesforce for a new count in Salesforce, and then you connect that through to NetSuite and create a new customer. And then you also connect on new object with the Salesforce connector inside of your flow, listening to Salesforce for closed won opportunities. I guess that'd be on modified object, but on modified, looking for closed won opportunities. And when you get that closed won opportunity, create a corresponding maybe invoice inside of NetSuite. So each one of those would be a flow, and that's the way companies think about their integrations. And they also don't necessarily think about integrations in from a conceptual standpoint in terms of what do I have to do when I have a peak capacity? How many vCores do I have to have allotted? What size of my worker do I need to have? What size of my instance do I need? Instead, they think about, hey, it's Black Friday and we have a sale going on. I expect 100 people to visit my website, each one of those individuals to perform 1,000 actions maybe. And all of a sudden, each one of those actions, if they're interacting with an API, would be 100 times 1,000. So they know how many messages they want to deal with. So that's really where one aspect of this came from. It's conceptually designed to put our integration metrics in terms of the way customers think about it. And then the other is you can purchase individual flows and individual messages. Well, you purchase bundles of messages, but you can purchase individual flows or bundles of messages. So instead of having to buy an entire vCore, you can scale where if you have a small additional project you want to do, you purchase a couple of flows and then you're done, rather than having to buy that entire pre-prod and prod vCore.
So let me see if I grasp that correctly.
Definitely.
Part of what was driving this change was to align it closer to what like an organization would be needing to do, for example, based on these flows, as opposed to trying to grasp in their mind how much of the vCores would be needed to achieve their goals. It's kind of broken down more in alignment. Is that correct to assume?
That's exactly correct. So what we saw, to be totally honest, although I personally never experienced this because this wasn't my job, but from friends that I've talked to, is one of the challenges we saw is you can go to the CIO of a company and that CIO understands like, hey, this is what we need. These are what we're integrating. And if you teach them enough, they could then understand the vCore. But then when they go to the CFO to get that approval, all of a sudden the justifying to that CFO why you need that exact number of vCores becomes really difficult. And there's this back and forth and you're having to do a bunch of education for somebody who's not a technical individual. And so if you put it in terms of this flows and messages, we can say, hey, these are the objects we're trying to integrate between Salesforce and NetSuite. For each one of those, we need this number of flows because we have cross communication going back and forth. So easy to get the CIO on board, because that's what the CIO is basically thinking of. These are the list of projects I have to go through. And then translating that to the CFO is like, okay, yes, this is all within the scope of the project that we have been discussing that you have that approved budget for. So again, you're entirely right, Diane. It's to make that communication of the project easier and the translation easier. Whitney?
Yeah, go ahead, Whitney.
Does this work? And excuse me if I just don't know it. How does this work for on-premise stuff? Like, how are you calculating this? Because when I think of, I've done a project and it was in GovCloud, wasn't on-premise, but it was a data migration. There's a lot of messages during a data migration, but most people would do a data migration on-prem. So if I need to do a use case where it's like a lot of volume, am I expecting to get in the bill, a big bill? Because it seems like you have the breadth of the flows, right? Because you'll have a set number of flows.
Yep.
And then you're also charging based off of pay as you go, the volume that you use. So how does one plan for stuff where you know it's going to be a lot of messages?
Yeah, so first I'd recommend that you talk to your MuleSoft account executive, your sales rep, because their primary objective, if you're going through a migration, is to help you do that in a successful manner, so they can help figure out something that will make sense for you. But to your point, the messages, yes, you would be charged for those individual messages. And those, if you do have a peak, what I would typically advise is that you estimate in advance roughly what that would be, so you can have that plan, so you're not coming back after the fact and saying, hey, we had an overage that we had to deal with. All that being said, I will just make a major call out on this slide that messages are actually fairly inexpensive. So they're designed to be fairly inexpensive. We have customers all the way from their smallest 1 to 3 people companies all the way up to McDonald's and Bank of America have switched to this model, and they're doing billions of messages a day with their transactions. So definitely designed to be scalable. And part of the factor here is, if we look back at that old vCore model, Whitney, what would actually happen is those companies, in order to deal with those high message volume counts they're going through, would actually have to temporarily purchase 1 or 2 vCores to be able to handle those peaks in capacity during the migration. And then when they get off, then they would basically end the contract for those 2 to 3 vCores, which actually turns out to be a far larger investment than the message side of the things.
So James, Whitney went right the direction I wanted to. Our study group is going to be basically 90% of the people here are going to work for customers or partners who work for customers. So the way our people learn is going to be helping people buy, not helping people sell.
Yeah.
So the perspective Whitney's bringing is really helpful. So if I'm working with customers who already understand vCores and they already are used to the limitations, because I hear you pointing, what I think you just said is, if I have a bunch of my own computers, you're still going to charge me by the number of messages, which sounds bad, right? But
it does. But that's also what they are used to with the vCore model. Yeah, because they were charged for the vCores on those servers that they were running as well.
Yeah. And so maybe you can, I want to hear you say it more clear, more directly. I don't have to pay for cores anymore. Yeah,
so you don't have to pay for cores anymore. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the entire
concept. I want to build a monster computer with 16 core processor, right? I can run Mule on there and only pay for the messages that are processed in the flows.
Yeah, the messages and the flows. That's exactly correct. So no longer are you being charged for the vCores on that machine where you're installing MuleSoft. You're being charged for the flows that you're deploying and the messages as well.
That makes even so RTF also. I could build a big old Kubernetes thing.
Yep.
If I want to spend the money on the computers, it's on me now. But MuleSoft's not going to penalize me for having a whole bunch of computers to run Mule on.
That's exactly correct.
Thanks.
Thank you for asking that clarification question.
Yeah, that's really nice. I can see the benefit of that alone. It just would be tracking the flows, and so it has continuity through any deployment model, really.
Yes, exactly. And it has that continuity through any of your deployment models. I mean, the benefit is that you're no longer having to track the individual vCores and be very, very specific on setting your limits on, oh, I need this one to be limited by this amount. I need this other one to be limited by this other amount. Exactly correct. So it works great for the different deployment models, and it makes it so that it's very easy for you to transition your application between self-managed Kubernetes that you have running on your server to then if you want to host that on AWS, or if you want to ultimately switch those to Cloud Hub 2.0, you never even have to ask yourself, what are the implications of me no longer controlling these servers that it's running on my throughput capacity.
James, there's a deployment model that was always really hard to do before we had usage based. And I worked at a customer that had it. It was one where their goal was to run Mule in retail stores all over the place. So like thousands or 2,000 retail
Yeah.
stores. It didn't work on vCores, period. It doesn't look to me like it works here either because of the left side of your screen, because of the flows. You're going to count a flow every time I deploy it, right?
So just to make sure I'm understanding, you're saying your applications are running on servers inside of the retail store?
Yeah.
The answer to that question is yes, you would be charged for one flow for each one of those. Basically, it's similar to a concept of horizontal scaling. So yes, you would be charged one for each instance of that flow in each one of those stores. I think the one thing that I would call out here that is what makes it so I believe this might be a little bit more scalable is because, again, you're not being charged for that entire vCore for your deployment location. You're only being charged for those individual flows, which is more scalable than the individual vCore. So if you have like 3 flows that you're needing to run in order to deployment into each one of those retail locations, it is substantially less than having an entire vCore deployed to each.
And from what you just said, if I have a cluster of 4 computers running one app, that'll be 4 flows, not one flow. If it's one app and one flow.
Just like it would be with your horizontal scaling, if you were using the old vCore model. So if you had 4 copies of your application, each running at 0.2 vCore workers, you would be it'd be 0.8 vCore workers.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you. Winnie?
I might not have heard this, but is this pricing for any point platform, or does it include also Composer?
This is just for any point platform. I do have some slides later on that talk about the automation, pricing, and packaging.
Okay.
Any other questions at this point?
Oh my gosh, you've got us speechless.
It makes sense, and you have to tell me what I cannot say. I think if not, you guys got to edit this stuff out. So I guess the next question, and this is my last question, and then you can proceed. And maybe because I've seen this, so you might have to edit this out. But am I expecting to get my initial contract I signed, and then I'm expecting to get an additional bill based on monthly or whatever for the volume or intensity of use? And the reason I'm asking is because I haven't deployed anything on my instance yet. I know,
Yeah.
Shame on me, but I pay up front, right? And then, or whatever my pricing is, right? And then for the volume of use, that's a separate bill. Is that correct? Or
Great question. So whenever you purchase access to the platform, it comes with, there are a couple of different options that we'll talk through in a little bit, but it comes with a certain message count associated with it and a certain data throughput volume associated with it. And those both act as buckets. And those are buckets that you can then draw down from. So you draw down from the bucket of messages, you draw down from your bucket of data throughput. And unless you exceed that bucket that you purchased on an annualized basis, then the answer to that question is no. Once you hit 80% of that volume, your account executive actually receives a message saying, hey, you're at 80% of your volume. Maybe you want to follow up with this customer just to make sure they're good to go. Then they'll reach out to you and make sure, like, hey, are you tracking for the remaining 3 months with that 20% that you have remaining? Or do you plan to increase consumption before the year turns over? If you need to increase it a little bit, they can work out with you on what that additional would be.
okay, makes sense.
Awesome.
James Genavi has asked, how are the vCores considered for the new license? Like while deploying an application in the runtime manager, we still have the option to choose the worker or replica size. Let's say that application needs a 1 vCore to run, and we've used 2 vCores. In other words, how does that play out? We can still choose can we still choose the vCore size on the new model?
There is some flexibility there. There's one setting there that I actually have to get a confirmation on. I will let you know I've actually not personally deployed to the flows and messages. I've worked with a lot of people who have, but I've not personally done the deployment myself. As ironic as that is. But there's one nuance there. There is the flexibility for you to have some control over how you deploy it, just like previously, it will default to that 0.1 vCore worker or replica if you're deploying to Cloud Hub 2.0. But it's not that you can just go and deploy to 16 gigabyte vCore workers with every single one, because otherwise that would really inflate MuleSoft's cost behind the scenes, to be totally honest. So there is some more flexibility behind how we're managing things behind the scenes, and I'll get that exact answer for you, and I can share that with Diane, so you can share it in the notes if that works.
Great, thank you. That sounds good. Because I'm looking to see, I think on our hyperautomation license that we still can choose the vCore sizes.
Yeah.
But that may come under a different category anyway because it's a hyperautomation license.
No, the one you have is the normal. It's using this flows and messages.
Okay, I'm gonna go look and see what that looks like. Okay.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. One other thing I do want to call out is that you do also have your API management capacity. So MuleSoft has release basically products, I should say, not SKUs. They've released products such as all of a sudden I'm blinking. They've released products specifically towards managing Flex Gateway. We've released products specifically towards managing your applications. And so you have an API management, Flex Gateway. So these are basically your number of managed applications that you're allowed to deploy. And you have your pre-prod instances and your prod instances that you're allowed to deploy and manage under API Manager. And note that these are on the per application level, so it doesn't actually matter how many endpoints within in that application you're managing. A couple of questions just came through the chat. Any questions that I need to address?
Yeah, she says, Janavi's asking further. So still we have a max vCore allocation for Cloud Hub 1 at 16 vCores and Cloud Hub 2 at 4. Or can it go higher without any additional costs?
I'll
have to get the answer to that and get back to you.
That's part of that.
I have something. Let's circle back after API management because I have more information on that.
Okay. Perfect. So basically, again, you have your API management capabilities inside of the platform. You have your Flex Gateway capabilities, which are available via your API management product that MuleSoft has released. But in your individual Anypoint platform instances, you do get a certain number of managed APIs. So how many applications that are web services, so RESTful web services that you're going to be managing. You could have your orders API that you want to expose via the public internet, so it's not behind a VPC, for instance. You want to expose that to the public internet. And so you want to manage it with security. Maybe you're using client ID, client secret protection, or maybe you're using any other, maybe it's JWT web token authentication. So you can go through and manage these instances. You put one API management util count over that deployed orders API, and it doesn't matter how many endpoints are inside of that API. It's just one per deployed application. So it's the same when you're managing your applications historically under API Manager. You'd go into the settings, you'd select the application you want to manage. It doesn't care about how many endpoints are inside of that application. So I do want to call this out. This has been around for longer than the new pricing and packaging model, but I wanted to call this out as another thing that you need to account for when thinking about your scaling. Questions, thoughts? Or Ryan, if you want to go back and
This
So
is
that's
going to come back to that other one too, because I
Yeah.
played around with this on our account. We have 2 APIs, so I went ahead and made 8 APIs to see what would happen. And
Yeah.
it let me do it. And they sat there on our account for a while, and then I forgot about them. And Diane's like, "What are all these APIs?" So, but yeah, it'll let you go over. But I imagine the next step would be a conversation with your account rep. Like, what do you know, we're gonna have to raise what you're paying for it.
Oh, you're talking about the APIs. Sorry, could you specify? I want to make sure we're very clear about what
Yeah,
we're
instances
over
in the
on.
control plane.
Got it. Okay.
And for the last question that Jock Navi asked, they're both related in a certain way. There's some kind of usage metrics we need to start watching for, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
And on that note, I don't have a picture of it on this in this slide deck, but when you are using when you have any point instance that is on the new flows and messages model, there's actually an additional option underneath access management in any point platform, which will actually go through your current utilization that you've used up until now. Also, as you just called out, Ryan, all the limits in MuleSoft are soft limits. What that means is that we do not immediately shut down your applications if you go over your messages count, or we do not immediately block you from deploying that additional flow, where what actually will happen is your account executive will receive a notification that you've gone over, and they will reach out to you to understand what the basis of that is, and just make sure they can help you either get back into compliance, or to figure out what your actual capacity needs are, so you can have a conversation on how you can scale your utilization there.
Yeah, take a peek in the chat.
Well, since we're a customer, it's in the chat, but that's not going to make it to the recording. So
No, I didn't want it to be in the recording. I didn't think you'd want it in the recording anyway.
No,
but
I do. I absolutely do.
Okay.
So later on, I can share my screen and show
what we have. Yeah.
We're a customer. We can show what it looks like to be a usage-based customer.
So essentially what should have happened in this case when all this all these APIs were being managed in this one environment, they should have said, oh, hey, you have exceeded, or something like that, right?
Yep.
Now it has no data. Does it matter if it has there's been no processing through them, right?
And that's probably why they didn't reach out to you instantaneously, because is for that exact reason. So typically what will happen is the account executives, and again, this is not an official policy, so they have the ability to reach out to you as soon as you go over compliance. But from the ones I've personally worked with, typically what they will do is they'll see like, hey, is this a spike? They might reach out over the phone to somebody that they have a personal relationship, just to get a better understanding, a little bit less formal. And it's really if you stay out of compliance for an extended period of time. I'm not going to put a time unit on that, but officially they are allowed to reach out to you as soon as you hit that above that threshold. So I just want to put that out there.
So everything I'm hearing so far, James, just as like a gut check, because you joined MuleSoft 4 years ago. I got into it like 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And each of the little changes I'm hearing, if you hear them as an innocent customer, you might be worried or afraid. But just from my own intuition and my own experience, all of them are improvements for the buyer, as every which one that you showed so far. I can tell everyone's better for the buyer.
That's exactly it, to be totally honest. The challenge we had was MuleSoft was designed for enterprise companies, and the pricing model was a pricing model they were used to interacting with other enterprise SaaS products like AWS, for instance. They were used to interacting with this pricing model. So they didn't really run into much headaches early on from that. But what happened was down the road, we wanted to be able to scale to meet a broader customer base. We didn't want it to be just Banks of America of the world. We wanted to be able to work with your mom and pop shops, 3 to 4 employees. And so
without making it worse for Bank of America.
Yes, exactly. Without making it worse for Bank of America. 100% correct. And so that's where we basically went out and did a survey of a bunch of our customers, where we basically did the iterative development approach that we talk about with our APIs when you're developing APIs, but switched that over and went through that iterative development approach for how we were going to release this new pricing and packaging model to make it favorable for them while making it still that there was an effective business model that MuleSoft could operate under.
This is not binding, but if a customer was very entrenched in the old, because I get a lot of people in my classes who are long years on the old pricing model, and they're considering, are we ready to move over? We're scared. Is it something they could request is a ceiling, like, if I switch over, can you promise me I won't pay more this next year than I would have the other way? Would sales entertain that?
So again, all of these conversations you should have with your account executives, but the standard process for customers currently on the old pricing and packaging model and are considering coming over to the new pricing and packaging model, what part of that exercise actually is we bring in specialists under that are familiar with both pricing and packaging models and actually use your data on what you're consuming today, as well as what your growth plans are for that next year. And then do a side-by-side comparison of what the two models will look like so you can make that informed decision.
Yeah. But when you had that slide before, it said from cores to consumption. It didn't say it exactly that, but it's not optional. Someday everybody's going to
So as of right now, the answer is that today we do have customers who are still on the old pricing and packaging, as you're aware. In the I will say all new customers are on the new pricing and packaging model. But I do not personally know, nor if I did, could I disclose whether or not we are allowed, or whether or not we plan to ultimately eventually sunset the vCore model, or when that will occur.
Sure.
Yeah. Sorry for not being able to answer more on that.
But probably, no, I got it. It's not like so it's not a for sure, but no, you are answering it. You don't have any conclusive statement that everyone has to stop doing vCores for sure. Certainty.
As of right now, the answer is we still have ones that are on the old vCore model. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That I think that'll be comforting to some of them who are scared that they're not going to get forced here.
Exactly. And it's one of those things that what we've been doing with customers is we've been especially those customers who've been on the vCore model for so long and are really comfortable with it, where our approach has been really a collaborative approach, where we've been going through and sitting down with them and saying, okay, let's not make the change this year. Let's go through and continue what you're doing this year and see, like, hey, for this next year, we're going to keep our assessment that we ran today to see what that would have looked like. And then look back at a year from now to see did that hold true, in order to build up that confidence before they're willing to move to this type of model. Other questions?
Yeah, I have one. Does MuleSoft have any best practices? Being a small company or micro company, like myself, what are the best practices around this? Because when I think that I've been in MuleSoft, work in some capacity working for MuleSoft since 2016, and it's always been a push for API-led connectivity approach, and with that comes a lot of flows, like at least source flows, like public flows. So how does a company take advantage of that approach, or what is the approach to now limit the number of flows? So let's, since you only have a certain number of flows that you can use, so you can't really say, I'm going to design a whole bunch of APIs and have Max come. You see what I'm trying to say? What is the trade-off, and what's the best practice around that?
What are the best practices? I will say that the architecture question is a really important one. And I think it holds for both though, right? So when you're architecting an API-led approach, it really doesn't matter if it's the flows or messages approach versus the old vCore approach, because if I'm deploying on a vCore, then the smallest I can get is 0.1 vCores for an application. So if I'm deploying 2 applications, then if you have 2 system layer APIs plus a process layer API and an experience layer API, then you're up to 0.4 vCores being consumed. If you're deploying on the flows and messages and your 2 system layer APIs each have 6 flows, and your process layer API has another 6 flows, and then your experience layer API has 12 flows, then all of a sudden you're up to 6 times 3 plus 12. So you're up to, I guess, 30 flows. So I will say a rough rule of thumb that works pretty well is that for many of our customers, when they were developing flows on the old vCore model, typically a 0.1 vCore would have somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 15 flows. So a good estimate, if you're wanting to determine whether or not you want to use the API-led approach when building, is you can estimate for each one of those 0.1 vCores that you would do before. You could say, we're going to do somewhere in the range of 6 to 10. It's actually mostly 6 to 10, not that 15 number. That was typically when you were getting up to about your 0.2 vCore capacity that you needed. So typically 6 to 10 flows for each 0.1 vCore is roughly what we see from a historic metrics comparison, which makes it so that you can do a rough comparison if you are using that vCore model to what you're using today with the flows and messages. But that's really an aside to what you were asking, Whitney. So the real question is, how do we go about architecting this in a responsible way, given the capacity constraints that we have?
Yeah.
And with that in mind, really what I would recommend is it's the trade-off between your reuse versus development time, right? Or development time versus cost in reality. And so when you reuse, you're saving on that development time. You're saving on development time, making it so you can put more work into new projects. So if you are really resource constrained, what I would recommend, this is my recommendation, is that you go through and say, where can I optimize my reuse? If I have a lot of applications that are going to connect to Salesforce, in particular the accounts object, the contacts object, and opportunities object, well, then I'm going to make sure to put something wrapped around how I'm integrating with that. Or if I have a backend database, I can do the same thing, be very maximize my flows for how I'm connecting to them. And then you can go through and make your process layer a little bit lighter, potentially. So you have it's a trade-off mechanism behind that. We do have a lot of resources in Knowledge Hub that go into all of the details that you can use for the individual different architecture approaches and considerations. But high level, it's a similar trade-off to what you were actually doing with the old vCore model as well.
I'm glad Whitney brought this one up because of the slide you're on. Because I think I have to change something I said before about everything being better for the buyer. We'll see if I'm wrong. But so one thing that's better from what you just described, I mean, if I'm going to do API led with vCores or with consumption, you're using different words, and you can please correct me if I shouldn't say those two.
No, it's fine.
I think of it as capacity versus consumption, though. With the new model, with the old model, we were incentivized to concentrate things into individual system API. So coarse-grained APIs was better because I didn't have to spend so many vCores. I could run 38 flows in one system API and still pay 1.1 vCore if I was pretty good at my coding. You know what I mean? But now,
if you didn't have high throughput, yeah.
It's the same cost anyway. If I split them into 6 system APIs or one system API, I'm counting flows. So now from that side, that's not from the API side. If I have 6 system APIs, I use up 6 different APIs. And with the old model, James, I had infinite APIs. I wasn't capped on how many APIs. So that
Yeah.
sounds worse.
Yeah, so I will say, like, yes, I there are actually a few nuances here around that old model. But theoretically, you're correct. Where a long time ago, in fact, it's actually been substantially longer than a lot of people actually are aware of.
Oh,
We did not charge for APIs under management. And then we transitioned and we put a cap for customers where it was basically you would get a 10 by 10 is what it would be referred to. So 10 pre-prod, 10 prod.
okay.
And then we've now made that more granular where you can go through and depending on your pricing model, you get less in your smaller initial startup offering. You get more in the larger one, but then you can also purchase them standalone. And we also have a tool specifically designed where it comes with API management capabilities as well as your Flex Gateway and some other features and functionality related to API management. So you are correct that way back when, yes, there was that no API under management restriction. That changed far more recently, and it had to do with the fact that, to be totally honest, MuleSoft actually sees the cost for a lot of the ways people are deploying APIs under management because they're deploying them with proxies typically. And so that decision came from the decision to put such an emphasis on Cloud Hub development.
Well, and you guys have been adding, I'll say I don't know, MuleSoft has been
That's
adding
fine.
so much more. So API endpoint monitoring and
Yes.
visualizer, and there's a bunch of stuff we get for APIs that we used to just be happy that we got for free. So I don't mind that
Yeah.
we have to pay for,
But no, you're totally correct. I will just say you are correct. But it's all of that functionality that you're talking about, as well as the underlying costs associated with when you deploy it, the costs associated with MuleSoft being able to operate that infrastructure.
Yeah.
Is where that decision ultimately came from.
Speaking of a proxy app, I know we generally don't use that in production as much as we do a basic endpoint, but that proxy app would count as another flow, wouldn't it? As opposed to a basic endpoint.
I would have to double check. It might count as a single flow. I have not looked into that one.
Okay.
I do want to jump forward just a couple of slides because
Janavi had a
ahead.
question. Sorry, James. I know
Go
we're
ahead.
loading you with a lot of questions.
No, you're fine. That's the whole purpose of this.
And James, that next meeting is flexible.
Yeah, okay. Sounds good.
Yeah, go ahead. Janavi asked, do we have any documentation related to the comparison between the two options? The Anypoint platform subscription info available online is still based on base, platinum, and titanium subscriptions. Is there anything?
There is a variant online for the flows and messages. I'll have to see. I believe it's on the docs.mulesoft.com page where it does talk about flows and messages under a section, but I'll have to confirm and find that link and I can send it to you, Diane.
Okay, thanks.
The one thing I do want to call out, or a couple of things I want to call out in the flows is, again, flows are counted for the source. So it doesn't matter what's happening in the processing section. So this could, again, be a choice router or a standard series of like sequential events. That does not matter. So either a source with a choice router, choice with a scatter gather, choice with a batch job. Those are all going to be a single flow. The one thing that makes this a little bit more confusing is the API kit router. So the API kit router flow does count for each one of the resource method pair endpoints. And part of the reason why is because the decision was made that basically if you're configuring this with your HTTP listeners and you're saying, hey, I'm going to create a separate HTTP listener for each one of these resource method pairs, that would be 3 flows. So we want to basically make sure each one of those resource method pair flows do count with the API kit router. Again, part of the reason behind this is to say, hey, we don't want to make it so that people can find a loophole around the flows convention where they basically create a single source and then build infinite size applications behind the scenes. For better or for worse, that is the decision that was made. Just want to put that out there. So your API kit router, those resource method pair flows do count as separate flows.
Nope. I as a experienced user, I do not feel cheated. That seems totally fine. I can see a way around it, and anybody who codes around it is going to have the ugliest application. So
that, to be totally honest, my conversation I've had with people internally was, I was like, yeah, I can. There are ways around everything in coding, right? Yeah. I mean, the benefit to MuleSoft is it is incredibly flexible. But as soon as you start to work around it too much, then you lose the benefit of working with MuleSoft.
You got it.
But any other questions, thoughts?
Because I'm thinking more on the left side, what you're going to see a lot of is, I mean, in a lot of my real work, like platform event listeners from Salesforce or Kafka listeners from Kafka, you gotta charge. I mean, it does seem to match. All of those are counting roughly the same thing. So
that's exactly the thing. So it makes it now that every type of application you're building is being charged really the same way. That's exactly correct. You're right on point there, Brian, where it doesn't matter now what type of application you're building. It'd be an async API, RESTful API, batch processing, all of them are being charged that same approach where your scheduling event is triggering your flow and your charge for each type of those triggering events. Exactly.
So to deepen that question, and if you have another slide, kick me there. Is that the point where you count the messages?
Great question. Yeah, so the messages are really simple, sweet, to the point. It's just one trigger. So if you have a flow that's a scheduled trigger, if it's scheduled to trigger once every hour, just to keep my math really easy, you'll be charged for 24 messages in the given given day. If you're using an on new message in Salesforce and you detect an updated record inside of Salesforce, then that triggers your flow to run. If you had two of those new objects in Salesforce, then you would have two messages trigger. If you have an HTTP request and it's triggered when customers interact with your website, and let's say they purchase the Pay Now button or something like that on your website, that triggers it to run. If you have 100 customers clicking that Pay Now button, then you're going to get 100 Mule messages. It really doesn't matter what's happening behind the scenes here. Doesn't matter if you're going through and making decisions with this with a choice router. Doesn't matter if you're doing sequential processing of an array of data that was received by it. You're really the message is really counted as the triggering of that source. It's the triggering of the source. How many of those sources were triggered in an interval of time?
So if you have something that pulls a batch, then that's still one message, even though you have a bunch of records coming through.
Yep. It does not matter if that's an array of records or not. Exactly.
Okay.
It might hit your data throughput number.
That's what I was going to say. That's the one key there is if we do go back to that data throughput, if you do have an array of messages, you do have a higher data throughput. But to be totally honest, we've done a lot of studies, and the majority of our customers don't have to worry about the data throughput. Primarily, you have to worry about the data throughput if you're like streaming videos or streaming pictures as a part of your Mule app, because those are really hefty data throughputs. Any other questions?
I think this is a very awesome presentation, by the way, James. And I'm trying to remember when I purchased. I don't know if I got this. I don't remember, but it's a blur. But I think the way you're breaking this down I guess this is a feedback, unsolicited feedback. The way you're breaking this down, would really help the buyer, right? To know what they're getting. Because now I'm looking at this message. I'm looking at, sorry, this presentation, and I'm thinking, oh, I got to go back and I got to look at what I have so that I can now, design in a way that, and I know we were talking about VCores versus non-VCores, but I still have to make sure that I design, my back end stuff so that it fits Mule, so that Mule is now, me bringing this on as a small business owner, I can see a return on my investment,
I agree with you 100%. I do think that there's been a lot of internal learning on how to present this, and a lot of internal learning in how to help customers understand the benefits of the new approach. And I think that is one thing that we will only get better with over the course of time. It has been a learning curve for many people who've been here since the vCore days, just because it's a different model. And I will say, I do think that putting it in terms of the way customers think about it ultimately helps down the road for how we convey that to them during the buying process or during the post-sales process, during enablement, etc. It just is a shift. And with their shift, there's always change management. I think you're exactly right there, Whitney. And that's actually why when I was going through and after Diane asked me if I could if I could help go through this session today, I was like, I don't want to use the standard slides that we put into most decks. I don't want to just stay on these slides here. These are the main ones you'll see in most decks. And that's because I know that people here want to get that one step deeper. And I think having these other slides really helps drive that home.
Yes.
Are those
Definitely.
are they new inventions? Did you just make these?
I did not. I will not take credit for that. I have a good friend who put them together when the new pricing and packaging first came out, and I did borrow them from that. So
We are enthusiastic fans of your friend.
you and me both. He's a wizard at slides. So the one other thing I do want to call out for the pricing and packaging, this is just a one slide. You'll see this in any conversation you have with your customers or you have with your account executives. I do want to call out the business groups. This is actually not a change. This is not a change from the old one to the new one, but you have your old, it used to be that I believe gold and platinum, I'd have to go back and double check, did not allow multiple business groups. So integration starter is basically the equivalent of that. So you get basically just the one business group. Advanced, you get your business groups that you can create. So that's the main other thing I want to call it. Same with the monitoring. That was the same thing. You got the advanced monitoring with titanium on the old options. I do want to call out though that we do have this automation bundle that it's basically the equivalent of the functionality of starter plus all of our other automation capabilities. So that's one other thing that you need to be aware of. The other thing that I want you to be aware of is all automation packages now come with what's called Premier Success Plans. So that's something else that's really, to your point, Ryan, is in the favor of the customer, because that was actually not the case historically. So with gold, platinum, and titanium, you would get, it was either, I think it was platinum is when you would start getting access to what the old equivalent of success plans were with MuleSoft, and then titanium would have more of them. So with that in mind, I do want to call out that you do get Premier Success Plan automatically with any of these MuleSoft offerings. Incredibly valuable for customers. There is another step above this called Signature Success, which is basically where you have a dedicated account manager who will work with you and be more personalized in their engagements with you. They're basically focused on you and a couple of other accounts and are managing that entire relationship. on the implementation, et cetera side. But Premier Success is where what you get automatically with all of these bundles. And what this allows you to do is you automatically get targeted guidance, best practice sections. You can meet with expert coaches. So Whitney, if you wanted to go through and have a conversation with an expert coach about like, hey, here's my allowance, here are the different applications I'm going to go. Where would you recommend API-led development versus not? Given your specific use case, you could go through and actually schedule that 1-hour coaching session with them, and they could give you some advice. And there are also some generalized office hours that you can sign up for, which are on broader topics. So there might be an API-led office hour that you go to, and they will have a short presentation and take some Q&A. You also get your phone and online support, and then you get your developer support. So if your applications are hitting bottlenecks, it can go through and help you identify like what the cause of those bottlenecks are. So I did want to call that out because this is something that, in my personal opinion, is one of the most important features that we did include in as part of this new pricing and packaging. We're actually really encouraging and helping customers to see success.
Do we have that?
Yeah, we have that. Yeah, we well, I have been working with non-Salesforce cloud platforms recently, and there's some things. This is one example of one of those things that is like 2 steps up the entry. Like when you're an entry level customer, you don't get any of this stuff with. I don't want to name other platforms, but you can basically pick one. Now, all the ones you guys are thinking of when I say cloud platform, you don't get any of that. Like when you're the $100 free account, like getting started, right? and there's so this is one of those things you started at the lowest level. It sounds like automation starters are the lowest level, right? And we get 1 hour response time for business stopping issues. I can get somebody on the phone if I want to get somebody on the phone. I don't know. Maybe everybody takes that for granted, but go try some other cloud stuff and see what that's like.
I couldn't agree more. That the number of customers that I've had that specifically called out is really critical. It's really important. So because we want you to see success, and the whole purpose of MuleSoft is you're running key integrations between your ERP and your CRM, or key integrations between your website that your customers are interacting with every single day and your backend database that underpins that website. And you cannot afford for that to be down and you not have a path to get it back up and running. And so having this automatically here is really designed to help you do that and make sure that while you're implementing, you're also being able to use best practices. With that, I guess I know we're at the hour 12 mark. Any other questions, thoughts at this point?
Anyone?
I just appreciate you, James. You put a really good summary of it together. You handled questions awesome. I think our study groups, if they all went this well, I'm with Whitney. This would be this is one of our best ones. So I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then the follow-up questions, we will post those out also as you get that information in. So yeah, again, appreciate it so much as always to get clarity on this. It's what we get asked a lot, even as instructors or even as just having this understanding. So it really gave me a lot of clarity. And you hear so much stuff out there, sometimes you don't know how much of it is accurate if it's not really explained in a good way. It just kind of got the water's really muddy. So I think we got clarity. I appreciate it.
Actually,
Awesome.
yeah.
Glad
So
to hear that.
I got another technical question. It just occurred to me. Because Whitney asked it a little bit earlier, but I feel like we touched on it just indirectly. A lot of cloud stuff is use first, pay after. And
Yeah.
but they don't have to be. If I go sign up with one of those unnamed vendors, I can go reserve some stuff and get a cheaper price by paying ahead. It's built into their complicated pricing stuff. It seems like the strategy for you guys is you've simplified it, but it is pay at the beginning, right? And there's no use first, pay at the end.
Yes. So we always prefer to to do that resource allocation planning in advance and make sure that you have it so that you use first pay now so you can do your forecasting correctly. So you're never hit with just a bill that you're like, oh, now I have to pay this. I didn't account for it. And so that is why your account team actually is actively monitoring your utilization to make sure that they're helping you out in that planning the entire step of the way. Exactly right. So, but again, with the call out that it is a soft limit, we will not shut you off if you go above your message count. With that being said, that's when that account team is going to reach out to you to make sure they can figure out how to help you get back under compliance and what you need. And then they'll go through and do that planning project. So.
Question, I'm looking at the fine print down here. Dataloader.io, is that a MuleSoft product or a Salesforce product?
It is actually a MuleSoft product.
Okay.
Dataloader.io is, yep.
It is.
Okay.
I came across that in a Salesforce class because we're doing the Salesforce data loading in, and the instructor's like, and then there's this MuleSoft product. Diane, you should know about this. And I'm like, no, I don't know.
I've
Dataloader
used it.
is-
I've used it with Salesforce. So if you want to do like migrate data,
Yeah.
but you don't have so big of records where you need to do a batch process, you can use it. But I've only used it with Salesforce, so that's why I asked. I thought it was a
Yeah.
Salesforce product.
So it is primarily for Salesforce, which is really interesting. But what it allows you to do is you basically take, say, a big Excel file that you have that you've exported from, say, a legacy CRM system, and you want to import that into Salesforce. What you do is you take that Excel file, and inside of it, behind the scenes, it uses data weave. So inside of it, you actually map the fields in the Excel file to the fields you want to map them to for the related objects inside of Salesforce. And then it'll automatically upload it using behind the scenes the bulk Salesforce API. And it'll kick it off and go through all that bulkization behind the scenes.
What plan is dataloader.io under?
It's an independent SKU, so it's not actually included in any of those three main plans that we talked about.
Okay, so it's like an add-on. So you
Yeah,
buy
it's an
something and you want
It's
to add
an
it on.
app,
Okay.
isn't it? Is it a Salesforce app? Like, is
No,
it
it's actually
listed
not.
under the app? Oh, okay.
It's if you just search dataloader.io, that'll actually navigate you to the website. And they'll say dataloader.io, MuleSoft, a Salesforce company, and they'll go through and have all the information there.
Okay.
But if you're interested in it, again, I know I keep saying this, but it's partially because I have to in these customer facing events. If you're interested in it, talk to your account executive, just because they'll make sure you understand the limitations on it, the benefits of it, and also really just what you need in order to get up and running on with it, and also whether or not it's the right solution for your use case, because it is a powerful tool, but it fits into that broader MuleSoft umbrella of how do we get data from point A to point B, and so there might be a better way of doing it that's more reliable and more robust than long term. So that's why talk to your team and they'll help give recommendations.
Now, I'm probably out of scope of this, but I just learned about this and I didn't know. Now, if I guess, let's say you have Salesforce, you want to invoke a flow, because we literally had a study group with that.
Yeah.
We're paying for our flows on the MuleSoft side, and the actual Salesforce flow would be paid on the Salesforce side. Is that correct?
If you, as a note about that, the Salesforce flow itself, if you're talking about a Salesforce flow, there are other things with similar names, but if you're talking about a Salesforce flow itself, the entitlement to that is automatically included as a part of your Salesforce subscription. You do get a restricted number of what are called flow flow licenses, flow user licenses, which are the people who are actually allowed to build those flows. So you can think about those as being your Salesforce admins. But the actual flow itself is automatically included as a part of that platform, and it can invoke your MuleSoft application. So you're not actually charged for that flow, but it is on the Salesforce side. I will make a note that Salesforce does have API restrictions. So you are allowed to make X number of API requests. So this may be where this was ultimately coming from in that conversation that came up. So in your Salesforce platform, because it is a multi-tenant architecture, there are restrictions on how many API requests individual companies are allowed to make in a given day. And so if you find that you're coming up on that limit for those number of API requests, that's when, again, you can have a conversation about the number of API requests that you're hitting against Salesforce and whether or not you need more, in which case you can purchase on the Salesforce side of things more requests per day.
Right.
But
So
that number's
that's
pretty high.
a governor's limit, right? Is that
Yeah,
what
that's a
you're
governor's limit.
saying? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so but as far as the charge, the MuleSoft flow, that part, your MuleSoft entitlements,
Cover.
that you get charged on that part, and then the Salesforce part is in your Salesforce package, whatever you bought.
Exactly.
There.
Exactly.
Okay. Got it.
So essentially a Salesforce flow would trigger and invoke a Mule flow. You're covered under your Salesforce platform here, and then it'll be a consumption usage on the MuleSoft side.
Yes. And I will say that we are increasingly trying to make all of that type of interaction simpler from the customer consumption and understanding standpoint. Very recently, Flow got added under the MuleSoft umbrella. So it still falls for the most part on that Salesforce contract, like you were talking about, Whitney. But the actual product owners for Flow are under the MuleSoft umbrella as we really drive towards this more like unified automation story that MuleSoft fits under, because people think about integration and how do I make business processing run more efficiently. So it's a type of automation. Or we think about automate processing documents as a form of automation. Or we think about navigating websites and reducing the button clicks by having that automated. So the user's not having to navigate the websites, a bot's navigating those websites for them. That's another type of automation. And so Flow is automation inside of that Salesforce platform. So recently it actually got bundled under this broader MuleSoft ownership, though it still lives on the platform. So just saying, we are working towards trying to just make things as efficient for customers and as easy for them to understand. And with that in mind, MuleSoft is actually now taking ownership of more and more of the automation capabilities inside of the Salesforce platform. But for right now, those contracts are separate. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm over here talking. I'm like, interesting, so interesting. To be mindful of our time. James, any other final statements or comments before you wrap?
No, I just want to say thank you all. I had a couple of other slides, but we actually talked through them, so I'm not going to jump all the way to the thank you side. But just want to say thank you. Phenomenal questions, everybody. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a lot of fun. Hopefully we answered them. For those that we didn't answer, we're going to get you those answers and send them out to you. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat right now.
Thank you so much, James. Appreciate it. And Ryan, I'll let you talk about this next slide and it's a surprise. Ready? Drum roll. Aha, go for it. You're muted.
Yeah, a couple of things. So yeah, right now we should talk about Montreal Dreamin'. Integration Quest is a sponsor and advisory board for Montreal Dreamin', the first Montreal Dreamin' event ever. Some MuleSoft community members got it started, and you have seen them in here. They're the same folks in charge of Between Two Mules, Shabam and Ismeet, and we're helping them launch this event. So in August 15th, if you know anybody in the Montreal area, it is Dreamin' events are generally community-sponsored Salesforce events. Now this one is pretty MuleSoft community driven, so it doesn't say MuleSoft on it, but our community would be, if anybody's wondering if maybe it's going to have any MuleSoft, yeah, we're both speaking. It's going to have a bunch of MuleSoft at this event. So send your folks who can make it to Montreal in about 6 weeks, 5 weeks. We're all going to be there. Come meet us in person. I think this is going to be a cool event. So, and it's cool to see some folks in the MuleSoft community just kind of like create something new. So
Yeah.
this is going to be a neat event. So come be at the first one.
Mac's birthday is at the conclusion of this event too, with 3 different meetup groups being present.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, all right. So that's Montreal Dreamin'. And then I know we're both going to be at Dreamforce. I don't know how many others here are going to be at Dreamforce. I just this week got my notice that my talk has been accepted. You haven't seen anything on LinkedIn because I'm not announcing yet, but you guys know now that I'll be speaking at Dreamforce. So I'll be there and I'll see whoever's there as well. Be happy to hang out. I haven't figured out my travel dates either, so we'll see what dates we're all up there. Tell me if you're going to be there a certain date. Maybe we'll hang out at Dreamforce. So that's another place Integration Quest is certainly going to be showing up in force. I think do we have for sure 3 of us already, Diane? How many of us are confirmed already to be
Confirm,
be there?
myself, you, Audrey, Shivani, Sonia. Well, Sonia is confirmed for Montreal. She
Okay,
is
wait a minute.
somewhat confirmed for Dreamforce.
So greater than equal for Integration Questers, maybe
Yeah.
more than.
Right. And
Yeah.
Sonia, I'm sorry, not Sonia. Audrey and Shivani were accepted to speak also to present on 360 patient experience for
All right.
Rush. And I have also been accepted for hyperautomation with Joey Chan, and Gaurav is also, we're doing a trifecta. So
Okay.
that should be fun. And so, yeah, exciting times.
Yeah, I'll be doing composable architecture, which sort of relates to the question we were making about reuse earlier today. So that'll be a good one. So
Excellent.
good announcements. I'm glad you had them lined up.
Yep. So thank you everyone for joining us. We appreciate your involvement in this, and you'll have the recording. So if you catch the recording later, be sure to comment on that recording so we know that you came and saw it, and also if you have any questions. Okay. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day, and also evening if you're elsewhere in the world. And we look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Okay, James, don't drop yet. I want to show you something.